So thanks to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to present here. This is joint work with Luca Enriquez and Tom Wetzer. And like Eric, I have to apologise to our discussant, Jill Fisch, because we also only sent her a set of slides and some very limited materials prior to today's presentation. And this is very much work in progress, and really looking forward to all the feedback that we'll receive. So an overview of the project is that we begin by identifying what are coming to be known as the carbon majors and discuss climate pledges that these firms have made in recent years. Then we ask the question, we frame the question, are the pledges that they're making credible commitments, or could they be dismissed as just greenwashing? Then thirdly, we ask what would it take for a firm to make a truly credible commitment using the tools available under corporate law. And then fourth, we ask the question, what would a firm have to do to justify making a credible commitment using those tools identified in part 3 in order to be able to do so consistently with corporate law? And then we conclude. So the first part, the carbon majors, this is a term that comes from reports by the Climate Accountability Institute that I think, as most of you know by now, have made this very striking conclusion that a very small number of firms and state entities are actually responsible for a disproportionate amount of industrial emissions since human-induced climate change officially began. And so this has led some to characterize these firms as systemically important carbon emitters, rather like thinking about systemically important financial institutions in the financial sector. But we will just use the term carbon majors, and we focus our discussion here on those that are privately owned because they are responsive to the techniques of corporate law. Next point then is that many companies, including some of these carbon majors, are making climate-related commitments. So as is also, I think, well known, BP and Shell have made very strong noises about becoming net zero companies by 2050, about reducing various degrees of reliance on fossil fuels and diversifying their strategies. These statements, however, have come in for criticism and pushback, with some people dismissing them as greenwashing, others saying that they're not sufficiently ambitious, others saying that they are not necessarily going as far as is necessary. We would suggest that we can think about evaluating these commitments on two dimensions. So the first one, and the one that I think has received most of the discussion so far, is the ambition of the statement. And you can think about this as the face value of the statement. How comprehensively does the firm try to transition to low carbon operations? And this is important and has been underscored by last week's report from the IEA, the Net Zero by 2050 report, which shows that the oil and gas industry, which is where many of these carbon majors are operating, has actually made a relatively modest set of ostensible commitments relative to other sectors. And in particular, the commitments that have been made have focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions and not scope 3 emissions, which include the emissions of users of the product, which obviously in oil and gas is the vast majority of the emissions. So the ambition of the commitments is a real issue. However, there's a lot of discussion about that already, and that's not the one that we're focusing on in this project, but we want to acknowledge that we think this is absolutely an issue that deserves attention. The issue that we focus on is the credibility. That is, will the firm actually follow through on these commitments? And we can think about this in terms of, if we think about a credit instrument, the difference between the face value and the market value. And the market value is essentially the credibility of the firm's promise to pay, and the face value is how much the firm has promised. So we're focusing on credibility. Why does it matter? Well, investors and competitors rely on these commitments. Public policy may or should rely on them, and meaningless commitments paper over a reality of inaction or worse, that is greenwashing. So in order to think about the credibility problem, we begin by articulating three motivations for a company in making a climate pledge. And we're not seeking, by the way, in articulating these to say that these necessarily, any one of them explains any particular firm's climate pledges. So these are conceptual categories. So one is the business case. And here the reasoning would be that as the cost of carbon emission rises due to changes in public policy, then demand for fossil fuel products will go down. This is going obviously to come alongside stimulating demand for non-fossil fuel energy. The transition to this is going to be costly, so a firm that doesn't do this soon enough is going to find itself with lots of stranded assets, going to find itself in difficulty trying to play catch up to develop capacity in new sources. So a firm might consider that there's a good business case for moving sooner rather than later to anticipate changes in carbon emissions costs and to ready itself for the transition. Against that, though, a firm that makes carbon-based products now can make profits in the short run. And if it makes enough profits, it can reinvest those in transition subsequently. And so that may be the value maximizing strategy. So the key factor here, the key factor that distinguishes these is the expected rate of change of carbon price. So if it goes up quickly sooner, that makes transition, the business case for transition stronger. If it takes longer, it makes the business case weaker. Now that, though, depends on many factors beyond the firm's control, including domestic and international politics. A second case for a climate pledge is because of investor pressure. Now, these may overlap, so investors who want the firm to maximize profits, their pressure would be synonymous with the business case that we've articulated already. But there could be a difference between them. And in particular, changing investor profiles might support investor pressure for pledges, even if they diverge from where the business case is clear. So if the business case is a little bit more murky, a little bit more ambiguous as to whether transition is justified, there might be investors pushing for that anyway. What would these investors be like? Well, one category would be ESG funds. Arguably, these reflect non-financial preferences or some degree of non-financial preference on the part of investors, and they may push that in their in the motions that they support. The big three, arguably, a number of people recently have argued that, including Madison, that they can take into account systemic externalities to firms throughout their portfolio. The carbon majors are going to be major causes of those systemic externalities, and so the big three should have incentives to pursue agendas that would push carbon majors to reduce emissions, maybe even where the firm level business case doesn't support that, if they're thinking about that at a portfolio level. And then arguably also there may be halo investors, that is investors who perform a role similar to classic hedge fund activists, but they're motivated by climate-related goals rather than purely financial goals, and they perform a role of disruption and actually doing the activist legwork, which can then be followed by other funds that don't invest so much in firm-level governance initiatives. But together, these could, in theory, support pledges, even if that wasn't directly coming through in the business case. Again, though, this depends on contingencies, and in particular, the makeup of the shareholder body. And the shareholder body may coalesce in such a form as to support one of these profiles one day, but we can't take it for granted that that makeup of the shareholder body will persist over time. A third reason for making a pledge would be greenwashing, the cynical motive. And here, basically, the pledge just tries to create an appearance of change which is greater than the reality. So this is not incompatible with reasons 1 and 2. So a firm could have reason 1 or reason 2, or both of them, and then greenwash as well. That is, try to claim more than they're actually doing. They might be making a modest shift, and they might claim they're making a major shift in order to buy more goodwill and reputational gain than they're actually paying for with their change. But greenwashing by itself would be where the firm makes a commitment which is not actually something it's going to follow through on. So the credibility problem arises where the firm announces a pledge at one point in time, and then subsequently it has to decide whether it's going to pursue brown profits, that is high carbon strategies, or green profits, that is strategies that involve reduction in carbon emissions. And there's a time inconsistency problem for support for climate pledges. So the business case, as we said, is contingent on the change in the carbon price, which is volatile. So imagine horror of horrors that Trump were to get elected in 2024. A lot of the good work that's being done by the Biden administration might be reversed at that point. And so that could cause firms to then think about, firms that now think the business case might support movement, they might reverse that thinking. And then would their commitments announced today, would they hold to those commitments, or would they renege on them? Secondly, investor pressure. So investor pressure, distinct from the business case, is contingent on the makeup of the shareholder meeting, which is also volatile. So if we have a coalition today that supports the making of a climate pledge, can we be sure that coalition will be around in the future, that we won't get activist hedge funds who are simply motivated by the maximization of financial returns, leading campaigns to change the board in such a way as to reduce the greenification of the firm's agenda. And greenwashing, by the way, there's no time inconsistency problem because the firm never really intended to follow through even at the start. But with those other two cases, there is a time inconsistency problem because the firm's commitment depends on these other factors. And standard corporate governance mechanisms don't really help because executive compensation, which is ubiquitously tied to the stock price, pushes the firm to maximize profits, pushes the firm to pursue the business case and the contingencies associated with that. And with shareholder activism, the share ownership structure may change over time. So the key practical question in this part of the discussion is, could firms make stronger commitments? How and why? So firm level measures that could make climate commitments credible using existing corporate governance. So we pick out three, and the first of these is changes in executive compensation. A firm that wants to make a credible commitment can build meeting climate goals into its executive compensation arrangements. This is rare so far, but is increasingly starting to take off. And we're clear that this is not so much an issue of the time horizon. And here we contrast the European Commission Sustainability Report in 2020, which alleges the problem is short-termism. Rather, we see it one as key performance of key performance indicators. So if you compare, for example, Exxon, which has not made very much in the way of climate pledges with BP, which has made these net zero commitments, the Exxon CEO's compensation has a 10-year vesting period for restricted stock. So that is a very long-term time horizon as executive compensation goes. But the performance criteria, the KPIs, are all financial, whereas BP actually has a shorter time horizon, only a 3-year program, but the KPIs are increasingly now associated with carbon reduction targets. And so that means that the individuals who are at the top of BP are now seeing in their performance criteria for the vesting of their stock pay that they are actually following through on the firm's undertakings. Second possible channel will be governance. And here we would suggest board level committees that oversee the delivery of and report climate commitments. And we see this as being akin to the role of the compliance committee, and in particular having a reporting channel that's independent of the chief executive and will be staffed by independent directors with relevant environmental expertise, reputations, who then stake their credibility on the delivery of climate commitments. And they might have power to have things like input to executive nomination, compensation, assessment of carbon-related KPIs, and so forth. Now, the key thing that we would suggest here is that this be a channel that is independent of the chief executive. So if we look at what BP have done, just as an example, they've set up a carbon steering group that is to oversee their transition planning, but this is a purely executive function that reports to the chief executive. At the board level, their Safety, Environments and Security Assurance Committee is more of a more concerned with ensuring compliance with various pieces of regulation rather than performing the sort of strategic oversight of climate matters that we suggest a climate committee might do. The third mechanism that we put forward, and the one that we think is probably the most interesting, is a capital structure based. And so the problem with investor support for climate commitments is that the investors have heterogeneous shareholder preferences. So some of them are exhibiting a preference for non-financial goals, others are focused simply on the money. And we suggest that using an appropriate capital structure tool, the firm can endogenize a change of preference by the money-focused shareholders. In particular, a promise to take action harmful to the firm, conditional on failure to meet a specified climate target, would align the interests of those who want to achieve the climate goals with those who are simply concerned with financial returns. And we call this a green pill, although the nomenclature does not really resonate clearly with a poison pill in M&A because it functions differently. So the ex-ante effect of a green pill would be to provide a bonding mechanism to climate commitment. So the mechanism would be that the firm has to make a payment if it reneges on its commitment, and this makes it financially unappealing ex post for the firm to then renege. It crucially aligns the investors' interests then around meeting the commitment, because the ESG investors want the firm to meet the commitment anyway. The non-ESG investors want the firm to meet the commitment so as to avoid any penalty payout. This will lower the costs of shareholder action, and also, in a hook to Eric's paper, would make misdisclosure relevant to meeting the commitments, now more likely to be material for the purpose of disclosure. So to give a simple example of how this could work, imagine that at T0, the firm commits to green outcomes by a second time period. And then in the interim, the firm has to choose whether to deliver on its green commitment or renege on its green commitment and pursue a brown strategy. So if the firm adopts the pill at the beginning of this process, it also has to make a payment if it pursues the brown strategy. So if the business case is there, the business case continues to be there, that is the value of the green strategy is greater than the brown strategy, then there's no commitment problem. But we foresaw that the business case may be volatile. And so if it turns out that at a subsequent point in time, the value of the green strategy is less than, or expected value is less than the value of the brown strategy, then the green pill at this point hardens the firm's commitment. And so the firm will pursue the green strategy as long as the return from the green is greater than the return from the brown minus the penalty. So we've actually started to see some examples of capital structure instruments that look a bit like this. So one is Enel, the Italian energy company's sustainability-linked bonds. And these commit the firm to achieving a particular sustainability performance target by the end of next year. And the firm agrees to pay an interest rate which will go up by 25 basis points if it fails to meet this target. Now, in thinking about this, we think there's a problem with using this kind of structure on a larger scale, because if the payment goes to the investors, that could undermine their commitment to support the project, to support the green pledge ex post, because the investors get a payoff if the firm doesn't deliver on the green strategy. And so there's a risk that there might be strategic behavior by investors who opportunistically organize an activist campaign actually to push the firm to the brown strategy simply in order to receive their payday. So whether this is a risk depends on the costs of activism relative to the size of the payout. So the Enel case, the payout is 25 basis points, which corresponds to an amount that's probably less than the costs it would be to organize an activist campaign. But it doesn't have to get a lot bigger for the amount to be plausibly worth an opportunistic hedge fund organizing an activist campaign actually to push the firm away from the green strategy and then secure a payout for the investors in the short run. So the message that we take from this, and we have a simple model that demonstrates this point, but the point that we take from this is that if we wanted to design a capital structure instrument that would commit a firm in this way, we actually, if we're going to make a significant payment, we would want this not to be made to the investors, not to be made to anybody who might potentially secure control of the firm in order to influence its actions, but rather to a third party who doesn't have any voting influence on the firm. For example, an environmental charity, or through some structure using non-voting securities. We are aware of at least one example of a firm that has entered into a commitment of this kind using derivatives with a payment to an environmental charity, which would satisfy this requirement of being robust to potential strategic or opportunistic behavior by investors. So that then, having thought about what it would look like to make this kind of commitment, the next question is, when would a firm be permitted to do this? When would the board be permitted to do this by corporate law? When would the shareholders be permitted to support this? And here we get into the question of the board's fiduciary duties. And in both Delaware and UK corporate law, there are cases that discuss the board's tying of its hands to prevent it from making decisions at some point in the future. And the leading Delaware case is a case about so-called no-hand poison pills, quick-turn design versus Shapiro. The leading UK case is a case called Fulham Football Club versus Cabra Estates. And in both of these, the court raises a question mark about the ability of the board, consistently with their fiduciary duties, to tie their hands to make decisions in the future. And that is exactly what a green pill, as we've described, would do. We think, though, that there are 2 points to be made here. The first is that it is possible to calibrate the extent of the commitment quite carefully. So the size of the financial payment leaves always on the table the option for ex post efficient breach by the firm if it thinks that the costs of sticking to the green are higher than the benefits of not doing so, and just make the payment and do it. So it's not an unlimited commitment. And secondly, it could be possible to interface with a climate committee, as we've described, as a way of providing an independently oriented fiduciary out. But the second point, the key point, is that the extent to which a board will be permitted to do something like this consistently with its fiduciary duties depends on the strength of the case that it can make, that it needs the company to commit, that it needs the company to make a commitment. That is, it will be in the long-term interest of the company to make a commitment of this sort in the short term. And here we think there are significant potential feedback effects associated with firms entering into these commitments. And we think these feedback effects could be things that boards could use to justify the making of commitments of this sort consistently with their fiduciary duties. And the final part of the discussion is about that justification. And essentially, we focus on one aspect of a firm's transition or lack of it, and that is its engagement with policy. The carbon majors have an unhappy history of lobbying against carbon-related regulation. So studies have been done of their public communications, showing that the public communications seek to cast doubt on the science of climate change, at the same time as internal scientific discussion was very clear about the likely costs of climate change. So acoustic decoupling between the public and private communications of firms in this sector. And we also know that corporate lobbying gets results, that firms in regulated sectors that spend more on lobbying do better for their shareholders. So there is an issue here then about the relationship between the firms undertaking or carbon majors undertakings to pursue green or brown routes and the impact on regulation that affects carbon pricing, which in turn affects the business case for the green or brown strategy. So in Exxon's current disclosures, there is a history, as I've said, there's a history of lobbying against carbon-related regulation. There's no commitment to stop doing so, and this lobbying historically has at least plausibly delayed raising the price of carbon beyond when it should have happened. BP has now made an undertaking to work with policymakers around the world to deliver low carbon regulation, which, if it is a credible commitment, would result in speeding up the raising of the price of carbon. So we can think about this as a kind of coordination game. So firms who are carbon majors have to decide whether they're going to pursue brown or green approaches. If they all pursue the same, then their lobbying goes in the same direction. So if they all stay with brown, they lobby against increases in the carbon price for as long as they can hold off, and that makes their brown profits greater for the short run at least. If they all go green, then they lobby in favor of raising the cost of carbon, and that supports their new business strategy. So there's a transformational aspect, arguably, to the firm's commitment to pursue a green transition. But if they pursue conflicting approaches, then their lobbying will come into conflict. And that reduces their expected profits, because now the key determinant of the business case, that is the price of carbon, is uncertain, because some are lobbying for it, some are lobbying against it, and that will be resulting in a clash. And so the expected profit goes down. What we suggest here is that if that happens, the firm that's gone green probably gets hit harder, because they've had to invest in changing away from the pre-existing approach. Whereas the firm that stayed brown, they get hit, but not quite as bad. So this is a coordination game, and the firms have to think, well, what is it going to maximize our return, conditional on what the other firms are doing? There are two Nash equilibria. They both stay on brown, or they both go green. But how do they coordinate on one or the other of these? Well, they can make statements in public about what they're going to do, but are these statements, are they credible statements? Are they binding commitments, or are they just cheap talk? The firms can announce their strategies.
John, sorry, may I interrupt you just a second? Perhaps in the interest of time, should we, we'd like to wrap up, in the coming 30 seconds, so we can hear Jill's comments and perhaps have a few questions. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, this is my last slide practically. So the firms can either stick with what they've undertaken, or they can commit. They can switch. And if it's just cheap talk, if they haven't committed to it, then that provides no clear guide to the other as to which strategy they should coordinate on. But if the first firm, firm 2, has made a credible commitment, then it's committed to do green regardless of what the other firm does. That reduces the strategy space for firm 1 and pushes firm 1 towards pursuing the green strategy. So that gives a business rationale for a board to adopt a binding commitment in the form that we've described, that's consistent with its fiduciary duties. So I'll stop there and look forward to the comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So this is a great paper. I would say actually it's a great several papers, as you can tell from the scope of what John covered. My first comment is I think there's an awful lot here, and it's all really good, but I would encourage the authors to sort of think about what should be in one paper versus another. So I'm going to just very quickly go through the setup and then focus on a couple of the points that I thought were the most novel and interesting. So obviously the paper's built around the importance of addressing climate change and the fact that corporations are advertising that they're taking greater responsibility in this area. So, one more example. And the sort of number of companies that have made announced commitments is, it just continues to increase, right? Here are some examples and some statistics, right? But the main problem that the authors identify is that talk is cheap. We see an increasing number of these statements. We don't know if corporations will live up to their commitments. An additional dimension to this paper is corporate political activity. So corporations, on the one hand, are making a strategic decision about their business operations. Will they go green? And at the same time, they're making a second decision. Will they engage in lobbying that affects regulation, particularly a climate tax? And the reason that those decisions are intertwined is that the business case for going green depends in part on regulation. If going green is cheaper relative to staying brown, or staying brown is more expensive because of a climate tax, right, that affects the business case. And I think the observation of the link between the two is really important. John moved that discussion to the end of the paper, but I think that really is driving a lot of the analysis, right? So here's that one of the prisoner dilemma tables that John showed you at the very end. And his concern is, how can we prevent corporations from defecting? But it's actually two concerns, right? Defecting from their pledge, but also defecting and lobbying regulators to delay or decrease the amount of the carbon tax so as to make brown operations more profitable going forward, right? So there are two distinct problems here. One is coordination. How does BP prevent Exxon from defecting, both by staying brown in its operations and by lobbying to make brown continue to be profitable? And interestingly, I think this may be the rationale for some of these corporate public statements. If BP says we're going green, that creates a lot of public pressure for Exxon to say the same thing. But if Exxon says we're going green, we're committed to climate change, that's going to have an effect that in some ways might limit Exxon's capacity to defect. Right? Exxon will lose credibility with politicians. Why are you lobbying to delay the climate tax if you say you're going green? And it may lose Exxon credibility with customers, with employees, with other parties who have increasing power to pressure Exxon. So I think that might be part of the story. And I think that's kind of an interesting byproduct of the analysis here. Right? Greenwashing at some level is going to affect a corporation's reputation. The second problem is one of incentive compatibility, right? Officers and directors are making strategic decisions with respect to both, and AEW identify a variety of factors that might drive these decisions to brown, right? A particular concern, and this came up in a lot of the comments in the chat, is that shareholders ultimately have control, and they're going to want defection if defection is profitable. Now, let's bracket the shareholders who in the long or the short term might have non-financial preferences. Presumably in publicly traded companies, there's going to be a market, and we might expect investors who are focused on financial returns to step in. Right? So Stephen Davidoff, Solomon, and I identified the same concern about shareholder control and the risk of defection with respect to public benefit corporations. Same issue here, right? So AEW identified two ways of, or two things that are sort of currently in the debate as efforts to solve these problems. One is executive compensation. Another is reforming governance, green directors or climate committees. They make some good reasons why those are potentially problematic. Third point, more meaningful climate disclosure, bringing Eric's paper into the conversation, right? Obviously, that's going to have some impact as well. But they propose an alternative commitment device, right? And so here's your picture on commitment devices, right? We should, at this point, we need a nice comic picture because I'm talking really fast. So what's their alternative commitment device? The green pill. Really clever idea. It's sort of a voluntary carbon tax, right? We talk about private ordering versus regulation. So this is private ordering. Let's have companies agree to a climate tax in the absence of some sort of mandate imposed by regulators. It ties the firm's financing costs to achievement of climate goals, right? Financing costs more if the firm doesn't meet its goals. And what I think is really the heart of the paper is a really careful analysis of both the legal and the practical challenges, right? And you can spend a lot of time here. AEW do spend a lot of time here, but there's even more work that can be done. right? And in particular, what I think is interesting is the risk of strategic behavior can be addressed by directing the penalty or the payment to a third party, a non-investor party, so as to limit the possibility of strategic behavior. So I've got 4 questions, and I've gotten through all the layout pretty quickly. Let me identify my 4 questions. First, this is framed as a penalty, and obviously if you're going to term this a poison pill, you have to do that. But a question that I had is, would this work the same way? Would this be equally effective if it was a discount for financing instead of a penalty? And the reason I ask that question is that I think a lot of the legal issues are much easier if it's a discount. How can a board be faulted for a breach of fiduciary duty by entering into a loan agreement in which there's a discount if you achieve certain climate-related goals, right? That can't possibly be problematic. Similarly, from a contract perspective, right? This is not a penalty, right? This is a benefit. So the idea of some sort of limitation on the ability to collect a contract-related penalty or a penalty that's not related to actual damages, right? That goes away if it's framed in this way. Now, I don't know if it works the same way. I haven't thought through all of the implications. If it doesn't, I'd kind of be curious with respect to why. Second question. The size, right? This is a key issue. It's a critical issue, right? Because what AEW do is they tie the business case to the carbon tax, right? And this is something I'm going to just flag again on the next page, right? The only reason that it works as a commitment device is if the size of the penalty is sufficiently high that the firm is not going to defect. It's not going to go brown. I don't know exactly how you determine that, and I wonder if a penalty of that size is really going to be consistent with a practical contract, right? And a related concern is, how do you evaluate? How do you define success? And how do you measure success? We're talking about long-term operational decisions. How do you find the benchmarks along the way? And how do you accommodate changes in the world while this long-term contract is happening, right? What happens if there's a pandemic and you were going to switch away from plastic, but now plastic is really important because you need things that are safe or disposable or something like that. And obviously you can accommodate that to a degree with a fiduciary out, but that's a pretty blunt tool. And the same issue has come up with respect to executive compensation contracts. What are the right metrics? And are those metrics things that really can be applied in practice, right? And finally, legal issues. John did a good job in his talk about addressing those, so I'm not going to go into that further here. So final set of questions. Right? The business case and the relationship of the business case to a carbon tax, right? What's the optimal outcome here? Is green with an appropriate carbon tax better than brown? Is the idea that in the long run, either a company will be better off if it goes to green, and this is just a way of making sure the company gets there? Or is the idea that we could actually hurt a specific company or an entire industry in the best interests of society? The paper kind of elides those issues, but I think they're really important. And whatever assumptions the authors want to make, I think it would be helpful for them to be more specific, right? And that, of course, relates to the point that I promised you in the last slide, right? What level of carbon tax is appropriate? What are we trying to get to? Obviously, almost any business operation will be more profitable if it's green if the carbon tax is high enough. But is our goal even carbon neutrality, right? We're seeing an increasing number of observations. Oh, carbon neutral isn't enough. Businesses should be carbon negative, which would suggest a higher carbon tax. So what exactly should the terms of these agreements look like, right? Finally, getting back to the point about the relationship between the business decision and the lobbying decision. One of the challenges with climate change and business responses is there's a lot of uncertainty about the costs and benefits of shifting from brown to green. Right? Policymakers have to evaluate that in their decision about what level of carbon tax to impose or whether to impose a carbon tax and in what cases. I don't know how policymakers do that without industry participation. And I wonder about the green pill and its relationship to the lobbying decision, right? Are businesses going to lobby simply because they've committed, or is the green pill somehow going to incentivize businesses to provide more reliable input, right? So in conclusion, great paper, a really original and potentially effective tool, very thoughtful consideration. And 2 points that I just might flag. I know I already said the paper is too long and it covers too much, but John very quickly went through, well, what is the possible market-based support, green activists, millennial investors, and so forth. A little more consideration of the market-based support would be useful. And finally, the point about the relationship between private ordering and regulatory reform. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
John, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Jill, for those fantastically generous and incredibly thoughtful comments. There's a great deal there for us to take on board. And I agree, there's probably multiple papers here. So I want to just pick 2 points up. So one is about being more specific about what we mean by the business case. And basically, I think there are at least two sort of nested versions here. So one is from the firm's point of view, that is from the point of view of somebody who is not a diversified shareholder. For example, the chief executives hold a big stake of shares in that company. Does it make sense for the company to transition? And the point at which that will be the case will be when the price of carbon reaches a certain level or is anticipated to reach a certain level at a certain speed of change. And that's one way of thinking about, does transition make sense? Another way of thinking about it is from the point of view of the investor body. If the preferences of the investors are different than the preferences simply of a shareholder in that firm. So if the investors are fully diversified and they take into account the costs of the systemically important carbon emitters activities on their portfolio at large, then they may think that the case for change from a purely financial perspective happens at a lower cost of carbon than people who are just invested in the firm. So that's two versions that we can think about. And we try to bring those out by talking about the business case from the firm's board's point of view versus investor activism. And when we talk about investor activism, that's what we're thinking about. But we can absolutely be more specific about that. The second point is about discounts versus penalties. And I just make two reactions about this. So one is, if we think about penalty clauses, the rule against penalty clauses in contract law can be quite easily evaded by characterizing something as a distinct obligation. So the Enel contract, for example, it doesn't say that there's a penalty if they fail to meet the target. It just says the interest rate is this if this happens, and it's this if this happens. And so legally formally speaking, it's not caught by the penalty rule. So I think that's quite easy to set up. The difficulty with the discount and saying, well, we get a discount from a certain class of investor is how do we ensure that that is robust against the possibility that those investors sell out to people who don't care, and then there's a renegotiation that takes place where the covenant gets waived in return for some payment to those investors. And that's the problem that motivates our discussion about the payment to a third party. So maybe having a discount combined with a payment to a third party might be the way to go.
Okay, thank you so much. This was very, very inspiring.